Chapter 6. According to the records kept by the Yell and Cry, the two closest ranches to Alsop were Flatfield and the Lazy J, now Jerusalem's Wall. White Fox had ridden out before breakfast that morning for Flatfield. He said he wanted to find out what Mr. Sutcliffe knew about the local disappearances, and warn him not to send any more drives by way of Alsop. And if Mr. Sutcliffe could spare a rider, White Fox hoped to send word to Fort Riley as well. Jett had wanted to be the one to go. This ghost town was making her stir crazy. But White Fox pointed out that an army scout was likely to get a warmer reception than a suspected outlaw. I suppose he's right, Jett thought glumly, but it's been almost a week I've been cooling my heels here now, and I am fresh out of patience. It didn't help matters at all that Honoria Gibbons of San Francisco had the heart and soul of a schoolmarm, and a tongue hinged in the middle and oiled at both ends, as the saying went around here. She seemed to think that just because Jett didn't shoot her, Jett was actually interested in hearing every single theory Gibbons had about Brother Shepherd, the Fellowship of the Divine Resurrection, and zombies. First things first, Gibbons said, bounding to her feet. We've got a lot to do today. We've got what to do today? Jett demanded. Dishes. Gibbons hadn't even stopped to clear away their breakfast dishes, and Jett had a suspicion that left to herself, Gibbons would simply throw the dirty dishes out after each meal. Even granting that there were plenty of clean dishes and cups in Alsop, it just didn't seem respectful somehow. You do them if you care so much, Gibbons called over her shoulder. Jett was taller than Gibbons by a good few inches, but she had to hurry to keep up with her. Where are you going? She demanded, even though she knew the answer to that. The only things down at this end of the street were the Rost and Telegraph office and the jail, and she was pretty sure Gibbons wasn't expecting a letter. Of course Gibbons didn't answer. Jett caught up with her just as she opened the door of the jailhouse. Phew, Jett said in revulsion. We should throw some eau de cologne around in here. She made a mental note to look for some around Alsop before she came back here again. She could at least soak a neckerchief in it and tie it over her nose. Certainly we should not, Gibbons answered, though she was making an equally disgusted face. An unknown variable would interfere with my experiment. Experiment? Would you say something that makes sense? Jett demanded. Certainly, Gibbons said crisply. Finley Maxwell didn't become a zombie by any of the so-called traditional means. He was in perfect health, and yet he dropped dead for no particular reason and rose as a zombie. He was drunk, Jett said. If that was all it took to make a zombie, there'd be thousands of them in every city on Earth, Gibbons replied inarguably. She walked into the jail and plucked the ring of keys off their nail. Jett hung back by the door. The sun was up, so to all intents and purposes it was a corpse in the cell. But Jett had seen that corpse get up and walk enough times that she didn't trust it to lie dead when it ought to. Since she already knew no amount of argument could stop Gibbons once she'd taken a notion, she held her peace, her hand hovering nervously over the butt of her Colt, as Gibbons unlocked the door of the dead man's cell and stepped inside. Gibbons knelt down beside the corpse and dug something Jett couldn't see out of a pocket. Then she pried its mouth open. Jett made a small, unhappy sound of protest. Gibbons ignored her. She tipped the bag over Maxwell's mouth and poured. Salt is salt, she said matter-of-factly, tucking the little bag back into her pocket and getting to her feet. Will it work? Jett asked. Time will tell, Gibbons answered, cheerfully. It was just before dusk. Gibbons had spent part of the day shooting the sun with a sextant to determine the latitude and longitude of Alsop, she explained, in order to make sure they'd be back at the jail in plenty of time to watch Gibbons's subject revive. This time, both of them reeked of cologne. One of the things Gibbons had wanted was a list of the townspeople, so their next of kin could be notified. Jett didn't feel right about picking over things belonging to dead people, but she'd found a big bottle of Florida water among Dr. Butler's things. And well, Meade Butler wasn't going to be needing it. She hadn't bothered to mention to Gibbons the two of them would probably be on that list themselves soon. Brother Shepherd might be done with Alsop, but he wasn't done with Texas. That's what worries me. By the time anyone believes Brother Shepherd can raise the dead, they're likely to be dead themselves. She leaned back against the rough-hewn newel post and pulled out her watch. It was big and heavy and silver, like the one Father had owned. His was in some damn Yankee's pocket now. She'd won hers at cards. She flicked the case open. 7 minutes to sundown. The sky was still bright, But night came swiftly in the desert. Once the sun made up its mind to set, down it went, and day became night before you could hit the ground with your hat. Gibbons opened the door of the jailhouse. With a blue silk handkerchief tied over her nose and mouth, she looked like the world's most eccentric outlaw. She stepped inside just long enough to hang her lantern on its hook. In the light of the lamp, they could both see exactly nothing happening inside the cell. 5 minutes, Jett said. It might not be so. Close. In there if we left the door open, Gibbons said in distaste. The rotting meat smell was strong enough to pierce through the scent of Florida water, and the two mingled unpleasantly. And have every vulture in the territories roosting on the roof, Jett said. I don't know why they haven't showed up already. Because no matter what this smells like to us, it obviously doesn't smell like carrion to Cathartes aura, Gibbons said grandly. The turkey vulture has a keen sense of smell and can locate prey up to a mile away, you know. Is there anything? Jett began. The corpse of Finley Maxwell flung itself at the door of its prison. It had moved so fast neither Jett nor Gibbons saw it get to its feet. The zombies they'd seen before moved with deliberation. Jett thought they couldn't move any faster. She'd been wrong. Its body hit the bars of the cell door hard enough that air was forced from its throat in an unearthly moan. The air in the jail had turned cold every time it rose, something Gibbons couldn't entirely explain, though she'd offered Jett half a dozen theories. But now the air pouring through the open doorway was as chill as the inside of an icehouse. Maxwell's mouth was open in a horrible silent scream, and Jett thought of every hideous story she'd ever heard about people who woke from illness only to find themselves in the darkness of a coffin, accidentally buried alive. How much more horrible would it be if life, if awareness, were called back into a body truly dead? It drew back momentarily, but only to grip the bars in its hands and rattle the door in a frenzy. There was rust on the hinges, Gibbons whispered in a small voice. For a moment Jett didn't understand. Then she did. Rusted hinges might give way. Get back, she said, drawing one of her pistols. If it gets out, I'll shoot out the lamp. If she could spray the zombie with burning kerosene, its clothes would catch fire, and maybe that would slow it down. Jett didn't mention that even she might not be fast enough to get a shot off before it reached them. There's more kerosene in the saloon, Gibbons whispered, still in that dreadful airless voice. Before Jett could say a word, Gibbons was off, running through the deepening shadows. Jett stood, so still she was barely aware of her own body, and watched the zombie tear and batter at the bars. It went from shaking the door to hammering the bars with its fists. Soon Jett couldn't hear the door rattling any longer, and she knew it was because the metal was lodged fast and starting to bend. It was only a few steps to the stable. She could ride Nightingale bareback, come back for her saddle when it was safe to do so. She wished she was gutless enough to run. She knew she wouldn't. Here, Gibbons whispered in between gasps for breath. She had a wooden keg of kerosene in her arms. Pull the bung, Jett said. Kick it through the door when I fire. Jett didn't know if Gibbons would be fast enough to do what she'd asked, if either of them would be. But she knew they weren't fast enough to get away from Maxwell. Gibbons knelt on the boards of the sidewalk and began worrying at the stopper. The zombie had stopped beating at the bars of its prison and was now throwing its entire body at the bars. Jett imagined she could hear the protesting creak of the metal as it slowly gave way. The popping sound as the bung finally came free was loud enough to make Jett jump. An instant later, she realized why. There was silence inside the jailhouse. The zombie had stopped moving and now hung limply from the bars. Goodness, Gibbons said, looking up. That was close. It's dead, Jett said in disbelief. You killed it. As Jett watched, the body sagged at the knees, slipped down the bars, and fell over. The night air was already starting to warm. I certainly hope so, Gibbons said fervently. She pulled the kerchief off and wiped her face with it, then sniffed the air. It doesn't smell quite as bad now, she said analytically. With an expert whack, she set the stopper back into the keg. I guess one part of the legend isn't a legend, Jett said, drawing a shaky breath. Whether it's scientific necromancy or not. I guess it isn't, Gibbons said, sounding uncharacteristically subdued. She dug in her pockets until she found her little silver flask and offered it to Jett wordlessly. Jett took a long swallow before handing it back. Gibbons drained it. You did say when a zombie is released from the power binding it, its last act is to slay, or attempt to slay, whoever created it. I suppose you're going to say we should have just let it out. Not me, Jett denied. Even if we'd known that, all it'd do is tell Shepard there's a posse after him. We're not much of a posse, I suppose, Gibbons said thoughtfully. Still, we're here. And now I can start trying to find out how he creates the creatures. I'm surprised you aren't already in there with it, Jett said darkly. Gibbons shuddered. I think I'll wait for morning. White Fox felt a shameful sense of relief at riding away from Alsop. It was not because he meant to flee the fight the spirits had led him to. The destruction of the zombies and the defeat of their creator would mean a justice he'd never thought to gain for his family, his people, his tribe. It was odd to think he was also to be the instrument of justice for his first family. But so it was. He'd marked the site of the wagon train's destruction on Gibbons's map without telling her what it meant or how he knew it, and it fit as perfectly into the pattern as another silken thread on a spiderweb. No warrior rode into battle without preparation. He was willing to be patient until Gibbons had delivered the weapons for this combat. This journey might be a useless one, but at least it took him away from a place his thoughts populated with the ghosts of too many dead. Flatfield was a full day's ride from Alsop, which was only to be expected. A ranch wasn't its land grant alone, but the unclaimed thousands of acres of open range around it, and the ranches themselves were widely scattered. He wondered what would change when a steel rail road crossed the land, or when Gibbons's auto-tacopode was as common a thing as a buckboard or a conestoga. It was just past noon when he knew something was wrong. This was April, the end of the rainy season, such as it was, on the staked plains. The cattle drive that had disappeared a few weeks back had been one of the earliest ones. The drives would continue for the next 2 months, until the summer's heat became too fierce and the water holes and creeks dried up. He should have crossed paths with trailblazers, the cowhands who rode a day or more ahead of a drive to scout the way, or with the chuck wagon, always driven as if wolves pursued it, that went ahead of the herd so the camp cook could have a meal ready and waiting for the tired cowhands at the end of the day, or the remuda, the string of remounts every herd rider needed on the trail. He saw none of those things, or even the tracks of their passage. But by mid-afternoon he saw the first corpses. He'd followed the circling vultures to a waterhole heaped with the bloated bodies of cattle. More lay around it, their bodies black with flies and feeding birds. All the bodies he saw had been fed upon, by vultures and crows in the day, coyotes in the night, but they were still intact enough they could not have been dead for long. There's 100 head here at least, he estimated. And this is roundup season. Mr. Sutcliffe wouldn't have overlooked the absence of this many animals. He would have sent range riders in search of them, and when they found them, they would never let a water source be fouled or leave cattle dead of sickness unburned. Telling Deerfoot to stand, White Fox dismounted and walked slowly toward the corpses, flapping his hat to scare off the feeding birds. The vultures were too gorged to fly. They waddled away, shrieking imprecations at him. He searched until he found one of the bodies that was mostly intact and examined it quickly. He could not find any trace of a bullet wound, and its neck had been broken. It was the first such slaughter he found that day. It was not the last. By the time White Fox rode into Flatfield, he already suspected what he'd find there. He stopped at the gate to ring the iron bell, but no one came in answer. He rode on down to the outbuildings. Barns, corrals, bunkhouse, all empty. He drew his pistol before entering the house itself. He'd circled it to come in through the back. That would be where any ambush was laid. But the kitchen was deserted. The pot of soup atop the stove congealed and half evaporated, as if the household had been interrupted just before supper time. He didn't find anyone in any of the common rooms either. If not for Gibbons, he wouldn't have known what signs to look for, nor found them as quickly. But as he went through the rooms a second time, searching them as carefully as he'd ever searched the ground for a trail, he saw more than he wished to. The chimneys of the lamps are black with soot from a guttering flame. They have all burned dry. The logs in the fireplace are burnt to ash, and the ash has not been disturbed, yet every careful housewife saves ash for cleaning. The keyboard on the spinet in the corner of the parlor was uncovered. No musician who treasured their instrument would leave its keys exposed to the dust of the plains. In the library, he saw 2 glasses half full of whiskey sitting on a table. The bedrooms were prepared for bed, but no one had slept here. When he returned to the pantry, he found the door to the root cellar open, and for a moment he dared to hope. But all that was there was a Bible at the bottom of the ladder, open as if it had fallen. The cans and preserves, the bottles of whiskey and brandy that lined the shelves, stood untouched. He searched for hours, until he realized he only continued to search because he didn't want to admit Platfield and all who'd lived here were another casualty of Shepard's madness. The fact the house's furnishings lay undisturbed only meant its occupants had been lured, or driven, from it before they were killed. But at last the red light of sunset warned him night was coming, and he must seek shelter. He returned to the house one last time to collect some supplies. The still full lamp he'd found in one of the bedrooms, salt and cornmeal from the untouched pantry, the humidor of cigars he'd seen in the study. The Wasatcha called what he meant to do sorcery, and said it was wrong, but White Fox knew better. It was medicine for the spirit, just as herbs were medicine for the body. He didn't want to risk camping in the open, not with so many predators attracted by the slaughtered herd, and the house itself seemed too much like a place of ghosts. He led Deerfoot into the stable and used the loop of braided leather she wore as a bridle to tether her to one of the center posts. He made certain she was settled, then closed the stable door and propped a full sack of feed against it. He couldn't bolt the door from within, but this would keep it from swinging open. When that was done, he took the meal and salt and walked around Deerfoot sunwise, drawing a wide circle of salt and cornmeal on the ground. Spirit medicine wasn't body medicine, but if the zombies returned, perhaps this would keep them from knowing he and Deerfoot were here. This was not Meshkwakahaki medicine, but he dared to hope the medicine would answer his call, for in the long ago all the people had been one people. Last of all, he took apart several cigars to make 4 small piles of loose tobacco, one in each quarter of the circle. He lit one of the remaining cigars at the lamp flame, then used its coal to light the loose herb. The smoke was sweet, and the air was still. He watched the smoke stream upward for a moment before stubbing the cigar out, returning to the center of the circle, and dousing the lamp. The last light of day was visible through the cracks between the boards, but it fled swiftly. He sat quietly. The only sound was Deerfoot chewing the oats he had found for her. The only sight was the fading glow of burning tobacco. With the leisure to think over what the day had brought him, White Fox realized he'd been counting more than he'd known on the possibility this journey would permit him to send word to the 10th. Now when it was too late, he realized he should have done so immediately upon their arrival in Alsop. Only he'd had nothing to report then, and by the time he did, the zombies had destroyed the telegraph office. His only alternative was a message rider, and he'd hoped to find one here. It wasn't that he'd expected help. Fort Riley was far away, but his report would have been a record of events that was beyond Brother Shepard's reach. There was nothing he could do about that now. White Fox did not spend an easy night, but he spent a quiet one. When the dawn light shone through the gaps between the boards, he collected his belongings, swept the salt and meal away with a brief word of thanks, and rode for Alsop. That morning Gibbons was so excited at the prospect of finally doing what she called real research. She didn't even stop for breakfast before enlisting Jett to help her move the corpse from the jail to her makeshift laboratorium. It was too heavy to carry, so Jett rolled the body onto a blanket, and the two of them dragged it up the street. In the daylight, the body looked even worse than it had in the cell. Its hands and face were battered and broken where it had tried to hammer its way from the cell, and its skin had a waxy grayish undertone, as if the body was slowly dissolving. On the other hand, it didn't smell quite as bad anymore, though that might have had as much to do with the half bottle of Florida water Jett had poured over it as the removal of any curse. "This would be a lot easier if we used your horse," Gibbons gasped as she stopped to rest. "Nightingale's got more sense than both of us put together," Jett answered. He wouldn't stop running till he hit the Rio Grande. "Almost there," Gibbons said determinedly, grabbing her end of the blanket again. It took them over an hour to cover the distance from the jail to the saloon, and when they got the body up the steps and onto the makeshift table White Fox had created from a door and 2 sawhorses, Jett collapsed into the nearest chair. Couldn't have done that wearing a corset, she thought. Now and then, her costume had real advantages. "Now that you've got him, what are you going to do with him?" she asked warily, with the caution anyone would show who'd known Miss Honoria Gibbons of San Francisco more than a few hours. "I'm going to take him apart and see how he ticks," Gibbons answered happily. Jett bolted to her feet as if she'd sat on a bee. You do that," she said quickly. I'll be around." She made her escape before Gibbons could ask her to do anything else. Like help. She'd seen a tin bathtub in the back of the barber shop. It took her far too many trips to the town pump to fill it with water, and it wasn't a hot bath, but she stripped to the skin and scrubbed herself until she'd scrubbed away the memory of having touched the cursed flesh that Gibbons was even now dismantling. By the time she emerged onto the street again, the auto tacopode was back in front of the saloon. She'd heard the noise of it coming up the street, but by now that was a familiar sound. Jett could remember down to the day and hour the last time there'd been anything familiar in her life. It had been the night Court Oak burned. "I'm not going to think about that," she told herself firmly. "Not here, not now. Maybe not ever. I'll find Philip and maybe we'll go to California. Nobody cares who you used to be in California. I just have to find him first." To distract herself, she went down to the livery stable to check on Nightingale. He regarded her with disgust from the far end of the corral. He'd probably run out of the stable when Gibbons was moving her buggy. "Don't look at me," Jett told him. "I didn't build it." But she dragged a bale of hay out into the corral for him, then brought out a bucket of oats. The water trough here was dry, so then she had to go up to the town pump and carry more buckets of water until it was full. When she was done, she was as hot and sweaty as if she'd never had a bath at all. The water barrel at the back of the stable was closer. There were water barrels under every drain spout in town, but this late in the spring the water in them was stale and brackish. It would do for cleaning and bathing, but it wasn't something a body would drink if they had a choice. She'd taken off her coat and her vest before she started carrying water. Now she dipped up a bucketful from the trough and poured it over her head. It was warmer than her bath water had been, and made her linen shirt cling to every part of her, but there wasn't anyone here to see. When she set the bucket down, Nightingale walked up to her and began nudging her in the chest. He knew buckets meant baths, and he always thought it was hilarious to knock her flat in the dust when she was soaking wet. She was laughing, threatening to lock him in the barn and sell the barn, when she heard Gibbons cry out and heard the sound of breaking glass. She was wrong, I was wrong, the salt didn't kill it, it just made it get up in the daytime. Jett thought wildly as she ran toward the saloon. She'd reached the auto tacopode when she smelled a foul odor. Not like zombie, like burning hair and vinegar. "Gibbons," she shouted. There was no answer, and sucking in a lungful of that stink made her start to cough. She hauled her shirt out of her pants and dragged it off. Her neckerchief was in her coat, and her coat wasn't here. This would have to do. She held it over her face as she ran into the saloon. The zombie was still where she'd left it, and now the bar was covered with jars and copper tubing. The contraption looked a little like a still at Court Oak she'd never been supposed to know anything about, and a lot like nothing she'd ever seen before. And Gibbons was lying on the floor in front of it, unconscious. Damn it! Jett's eyes were watering as if the room were filled with smoke. Even breathing through the wet muslin, her throat burned and she desperately wanted to cough. This was no time to stand around and ask what was going on. She ran across the floor to Gibbons, then wrapped a fist in Gibbons's collar and pulled. The twill fabric was sturdy. It held, and Gibbons didn't weigh quite as much as the late Finley Maxwell had. Jett hauled the unconscious Gibbons outside, but she didn't stop there. The air outside the saloon was nearly as foul as the air inside it. She felt sick and dizzy, but she dragged Gibbons along the street until dark spots danced in front of her eyes, then dropped her and clung to one of the newel posts, gasping for air. It didn't help much. The dizziness wasn't fading. Jett sat down on the edge of the sidewalk and leaned back against the rail, gasping for breath. I learned how to pretend, swoon before I was 14, she thought, years before I ever fainted for real, because Tante Mère said men like delicate females. I don't think they'd like M near so much if they knew what it's really like. She pressed the cold of her damp shirt against her face and neck for a moment, then struggled back into it. Can't leave her lying out in the sun like that, she thought tiredly, and went to pull Gibbons into the small shade of the sidewalk. Gibbons began to stir even while Jett was moving her. She sat up weakly and began to cough. You just stay where you are, Jett said, but Gibbons had already dragged herself to her feet using the hitching rail, then staggered to the sidewalk steps to sit. Her hair had come partway out of its neat bun, and was a halo of gold-touched fire around her flushed face. Jett repressed an automatic twinge of envy. If she'd had Gibbons's looks, she would have had all the boys in Orleans Parish coming around. In a time that was over. in a place that was gone. I've thought more about home this week than I have in the past 2 years. She thought angrily. What's wrong with me? What happened? She demanded. What were you doing in there? Nothing, Gibbons protested automatically. Nothing that should have caused. What did happen? Derned if I know, Jett answered. I heard you yelp and something broke. I came running, whatever it was, it sure stinks. I was distilling some of the whiskey from the saloon, Gibbons said. She coughed again, experimentally, and then began taking her hair down to put it up again. I'd brought the spirit lamps in from my wagon. They burn alcohol, not kerosene. They're a lot brighter, and I wanted plenty of light to autopsy Mr. Maxwell. But I was running low on fuel for them. Whiskey's already alcohol, Jett pointed out. It isn't pure alcohol, Gibbons said. That's why I was distilling it. She pulled herself to her feet, clinging to the post for support. I need to find out what was in that whiskey. You just hold your horses, Jett said. Let me get some air through there first. I'm not hauling you out of there twice. She got to her feet, determined not to show a single sign of weakness Gibbons could use as an excuse to go with her, and walked down the street to the nearest alley. The buildings in Alsop hadn't all been built at the same time, and most of them didn't share a common wall. A fire could sweep through the wood buildings of an entire town in hours, and there was little way to stop its spread except by wetting down the wood of the adjoining buildings. Jett hated fire. She found the back door of the saloon and pulled it open, kicking a rock into place to serve as a doorstop. From the marks on the wood, the rock had served this purpose before. She could see straight through the building to the street. The saloon had double doors that could be closed behind the batwing doors in the unlikely event the saloon was ever closed for business. It was just as well Gibbons hadn't shut them, or tacked a blanket over that window I broke, Jett thought. Those things had probably saved her life. She got back to the street just in time to intercept Gibbons. Oh no you don't, she said firmly, taking Gibbons by the arm. This dang fool science of yours can wait half an hour or so. She hustled Gibbons over to the bench in front of the general merchandise and pulled out her watch. When Gibbons started to get up again, Jett took off her Stetson and walloped her with it. For heaven's sake, Gibbons said huffily. Yeah, you could have taken it up with the angels if I hadn't been here, Jett said. I have no notion how you managed to live this long without a nursemaid, I swear. I am not a child, you know, Gibbons said. Nope, Jett said agreeably. Just an idiot. Gibbons folded her arms across her chest and glared. If one thing headed the list of things Gibbons truly abominated, it was the notion of being managed and minded and nursemaid. Those persons who appointed themselves to such a role usually did, so as a first step to unleashing a long list of prescriptions. And Gibbons's entire life had been spent in a systematic overthrow of such things. Ladies did not wear rational dress. Ladies did not engage in intellectual pursuits. Ladies did not invent things. Ladies did not go anywhere without a suitable meaning male escort. There were times Gibbons wondered whether her life would have been different if her mother had survived her birth. Jacob Saltonstall Gibbons had shattered convention and earned the undying loathing of his Boston family by marrying one of his servants. And not even his housekeeper, which the Gibbons family would not have approved of either, but at least he would have been marrying an upper servant, but one of his Irish housemaids. That marriage had been the true reason his family had banished Jacob Gibbons to Chicago, but Mary Gibbons, née Mère Kathleen Donovan of County Cork, Ireland, had not lived to see her second wedding anniversary. Perhaps Gibbons's mother had been as much an unconventional freethinker as her father was. Perhaps the three of them would have lived an ideal, if eccentric, life together. There was no way to know. Gibbons was merely thankful that her father, instead of returning to Boston to hand his child over to one of his female relatives to raise, had engaged a nurse and gone west. Gibbons's childhood had been a happy one, spent doing essentially as she pleased, for though her father should have, by convention, hired a governess to succeed the nurse, he never had. Gibbons suspected it had simply slipped his mind. But if there'd been no governess standing over her to tell her what a lady ought to do and not do, there'd been plenty of other women eager to prove their worthiness to become the second Mrs. Gibbons by standing as moral preceptor to his daughter. Mr. Gibbons had never noticed their overtures, and they'd only annoyed their target. By rights, Jett's fussing should have irritated Gibbons as much as every other female's had. No matter how good Jett's masquerade was, Gibbons could see that was what it was, an act. Jett Gallatin might live as a man, but she was no more an emancipated modern woman than any simpering corset-wearing creature whose only ambition was to marry a man, any man, and raise his children. On the other hand, Jett might be as ignorant as a troglodyte and utterly unemancipated, but she'd never once demanded Gibbons stop doing something on the grounds of her gender. It was true, Gibbons reflected, that Jett called her an idiot at least once a day and had no interest in learning anything Gibbons strove to teach her. But Gibbons suspected Jett treated everyone that way. In fact, if Gibbons had been a young man and Jett had found him, unconscious on the floor, Jett probably would have called him a fool and an idiot and walloped him with her hat. I only wish she were more interested in the life of the mind, Gibbons thought with a flash of irritation. It would be nice to be able to talk with someone who was not constantly lecturing me on my unfeminine behavior. Her father, of course, barely noticed she was a girl. But to say Jacob Gibbons was unworldly was to understate the case. And even dear Dr. Gordon had occasionally hinted gently that the freedom Gibbons enjoyed might not be entirely suitable. "Time's up," Jett said, closing her watch and getting to her feet. "Let's go see what tried to kill you this time." Jett entered the saloon warily. Really, must she prowl everywhere? Insisting Gibbons stay behind her, as if some odd chemical reaction is something she can shoot. But once Jett had satisfied herself there was nothing here that was going to pounce on her. She excused herself and left Gibbons alone in the saloon. There was still a faint acrid odor hanging in the air. Since the only thing Gibbons had been doing had been distilling whiskey, the source must be the whiskey. But she'd performed the same distillation hundreds of times with no ill effects. So this whiskey must be different. She just had to find out how. She'd unpacked most of her equipment from the auto-tachopode already. She removed her microscope from its padded wooden case. It was only the work of minutes to fill a pair of her spirit lamps with the last of the pure and safe distillate and prepare a slide. Nothing. She took samples from the body of the zombie, hair, tissue, saliva, blood, and examined them beneath her lens. Still nothing. She returned to the whiskey and performed a flame reduction test. All that did was tell her there was something in it, for it released the same acrid scent as before, though in a much smaller quantity. Gibbons spared a moment's wistful longing for her laboratory in the basement of the Russian Hill townhouse. She would have liked to be able to administer this whiskey to one of her laboratory rats to see if it, too, would return from the dead. At least she had a lot of tainted whiskey, because the next step was to attempt to separate the contaminants from the whiskey for further analysis. "I have it," she breathed in triumph. She'd nearly despaired as method after method had failed to yield the facts she sought. But she'd persevered, and gained victory. "There's coffee," Jett said. "I made up some food too. A couple of hours ago." "I know how he's making the zombies," Gibbons said, turning around. Jett was sitting at one of the two tables near the door. There was a deck of cards spread out on the table beside a coffee mug. On the other table was an enamelware coffee pot, a cookpot, a plate covered with a cloth, and a clean place setting. Jett had obviously returned to the saloon and been here for some time. The wonder wasn't that Gibbons hadn't noticed. She could be entirely single-minded in pursuit of a mystery, but that Jett's presence hadn't distracted her. "It's probably cold by now," Jett added. "Don't you care about what I've found?" Gibbons demanded, delight fading into her usual irritation with Jett's obtuseness. "Sure I do. But in case you haven't noticed, the sun's about to set, so I don't guess anyone's riding out to Jerusalem's wall right now. And you haven't eaten a thing since yesterday." "I ate breakfast," Gibbons said doubtfully. "Yesterday, maybe. I can put it back on the fire if—" "No, this is fine," Gibbons said, abruptly aware of her growling stomach. She walked over to the table and sat down. Jett restacked the deck with a quick, economical motion and joined her. Gibbons filled her bowl with beans and bacon and poured herself a cup of coffee. She added a generous splash of milk, stirred and sipped it. It was tepid and boiled, since the arcanum of the percolator was apparently beyond Jett. But coffee was coffee. She uncovered the plate of tortillas, scooped some of the beans into one, and talked as she ate. "I'm certain you have little interest in how I arrived at my conclusions, but I assure you they're correct. All the whiskey here has, I believe, been adulterated. It was those contaminants that turned Finley Maxwell into a revenant, though I suspect they weren't what killed him. He fell over dead," Jett protested. "We all saw him, or heard him at least." Gibbons shook her head. I don't think so. When he left the jail, the morning you and White Fox went to Jerusalem's wall, he came straight here and started drinking. Would not have been anyone to stop him, Jett agreed, frowning. Exactly. And as a confirmed drunkard, his body was sufficiently adapted to the use of alcohol for him to remain conscious long enough to drink himself, literally, to death. It's possible to drink enough alcohol that one stops breathing, she added, since Jett was still looking puzzled. The effects are similar to a fatal overdose of laudanum. I guess I just don't know the right people, Jett commented dryly. All I ever heard tell of was someone getting outside of enough whiskey to pass out. I admit it could be an expensive matter to drink yourself to death quickly, Gibbons agreed. And a dipsomaniac rarely has unrestricted access to liquor, since they are usually impoverished as well. But that is beside the point. Imagine it, if you will. Maxwell, for the first time in his life, had all the liquor he could pour down his throat. So he did just that. Perhaps he drank as much from fear of what he had seen. Perhaps because once he realized that no one could stop him, it was the first and only thing he wanted to do. Maxwell drank enough to poison himself to death, and rose from the dead because of what else was in those bottles. The first component I isolated was datura. You may know it as Jimson weed, but while I am well aware illicit whiskey is sometimes adulterated with Jimson weed to increase its effect, since datura can cause hallucinations and a number of other symptoms, it cannot cause an individual to rise from the dead. But then I also discovered the presence of maculotoxin. Defiling poison? Jett said, stumbling through the Latin credibly well, much to Gibbons's surprise. In layman's terms, puffer fish toxin, Gibbons said. The puffer fish is a species of fish found only in tropical waters. In China and Japan, they are considered a great delicacy, even though many parts of the fish are poisonous. She paused, brooding. I do not think these two compounds can wholly account for zombification, but I cannot discover what else may be present with the limited equipment I have. Gibbons sighed as Jett directed a speaking glance toward the interior of the saloon, not even bothering with her anticipated jibe about poisonous. It probably looked to her as if there was plenty of equipment here. Gibbons thought mournfully of her stock of reagents and catalysts, her rotary centrifuge, her good microscope. With the contents of her lab, she could have discovered every foreign element introduced into the whiskey. I guess we've got enough zombies that we don't need to make any more, Jett said at last. Can we bury Mr. Maxwell now? I still need to find out why Salt cured or killed him, Gibbons protested. Now that we know Brother Shepherd is drugging his targets with something that allows him to turn them into zombies once they die. Look here, Jett said, her voice quiet and serious. In case you haven't noticed, there isn't any ice within 500 miles. That body is already going green. Another day in this heat, and it's going to turn black and bust open. It's going to stink, it's going to attract vultures, and for all I know, it'll make us sick. I don't know what you're looking to find, but we need to get him into the ground. Gibbons wanted to protest, but this wasn't civilization. In a city, she would have been able to buy a dozen 5-pound blocks of ice at high summer, let alone in April. Enough ice to refrigerate a specimen until she was finished with it. Here on the frontier, an autopsy was a race against time, and she'd lost too much time already. I suppose you're right, she said reluctantly. There's a buckboard in the stables. You think your buggy can pull it as far as Reverend Southey's place? I think so, yes, Gibbons said. Good, Jett said, nodding. We've got just about enough daylight to get Mr. Maxwell out there. I can put him in their stable for overnight. Tomorrow I'll dig him a hole while you figure out how Brother Shepherd got his hoodoo juice into the whiskey. Jett saddled Nightingale and used him to drag the buckboard from the livery stable to the saloon. The buckboard slewed maddeningly at the end of the rope, but taking it to the saloon was still easier than dragging the corpse the length of Alsop one more time. She hadn't been joking when she told Gibbons Nightingale wasn't a cart horse, but at least he was used to towing something tied to his saddle horn. Since it had been made from a regular wagon, the auto tacopode had the usual iron staple bolted to the back of the carriage for hitching a drag team to. A wagon brake could stop the front wheels from turning when a wagon was descending a steep grade, but sometimes that wasn't enough to keep the wagon from either overrunning its hitch or plunging over the side of whatever mountain it was trying to descend. It wasn't easy to rig the buckboard to that. Gibbons had to lower the steps so they could prop the buckboard's tongue on them, but it was possible. And between the two of them, they were able to drag the rotting corpse of Finley Maxwell into the buckboard's bed. For a moment Jett thought Gibbons had overstated her machine's capacity. But after a long moment when the auto-tachopode seemed to strain at the burden like a hitch of mules at plowing time, it began to roll forward, pulling the buckboard behind. Jett rode on ahead to make sure there was space in the stable. The only thing in it was a battered old shay the parson, or his wife, had probably used for running errands. When Gibbons arrived, she turned the auto-tachopode to line both it and the buckboard up with the stable door, then backed the auto-tachopode until the buckboard was maneuvered neatly inside. "You'll make a cutting horse out of that thing yet," Jett said. She waved Gibbons away as she came to cut the rope. A good piece of rope was a rare commodity out here. Jett wasn't a cowhand by any stretch. She knew she couldn't maintain her disguise if she didn't keep moving, just to start with, but she'd picked up their superstitious aversion to cutting a rope. A cut rope was bad luck. You burned it if you could, the same way you burned, or buried, or both a rope that was worn out. She finally got it unknotted and coiled it up carefully, then hung it over Nightingale's saddle horn. Gibbons came back into the stable just as she finished. "I found this in the church," she said, offering Jett a spade. Jett took it. "Let's go see where we're going to plant him," she said. White Fox rode up just as Jett was marking out the grave she'd have to dig tomorrow. She was about to ask him how his trip to Flatfield had gone when she saw his face. She'd heard plenty of things about Indians long before she ever saw one. People called them fierce, bloodthirsty, heathen savages. And that would have disturbed her more if she hadn't known Yankees called Southerners the same things. She'd heard plenty of talk about murdering Rebs after Beast Butler and his gang of crooks took New Orleans, seen plenty of deeds from them too. So she'd reckoned the Indians would be pretty much like folks anywhere. Some might try to kill you, some might ignore you, and some would go out of their way to help you. She'd met all three kinds since she'd left home. But the one thing that was mostly the same about all of them was how they didn't wear what they were thinking on their faces for the world to see. A preacher she'd traveled with once called it savage inscrutability. Jett just thought of it as good manners. She knew White Fox was meshkwakahaki in all but body, so she'd never worried about not being able to tell what he was thinking. The fact she could tell now scared her. Gibbons was rattling on about all her discoveries, leaving out the part where she dang near killed herself, and talking about what she still needed to find out. Jett suspected Gibbons would be making the same speech on her deathbed. Jett just waited, watching White Fox's face. "So what did Mr. Sutcliffe tell you?" Gibbons finally asked. "Have there been any disappearances that he knows of? Were you able to send a message to Fort Riley?" "No," White Fox said. "There was no one there to ask. They were all dead," Jett said. She tried not to show how much the news shook her. White Fox nodded once. "So I believe. The house was deserted, as if its inhabitants had simply walked away. But there is more to tell." Jett stuck the spade into the center of the shallow rectangle of earth she'd marked out. She pushed it down with her boot. The blades sank into the earth grudgingly, but it went. At least the clay wasn't baked too hard to dig. She left the spade where it stood. "Tell it back in town," she said. "Sun's going down." In the boarding house kitchen, Gibbons made biscuits to go with their meal as White Fox told the rest of his tale. The room was warm, both from the wood in the firebox below the oven and from the dozen lanterns they'd lit and placed on every available flat surface. Jett had stopped being afraid of the dark a long time ago, but that had been before she knew what it might contain. But why would Shepard want to kill an entire herd of cattle? Gibbons said, "They're worth money, and someone would be sure to see all those bodies. In another month, perhaps less, they will be nothing more than bleached bones scattered among the scrub," White Fox said bleakly. "He had to kill them," Jett said thoughtfully. "Beeves'll wander halfway to the moon if you let 'em, and they'd be sure to get caught up in some roundup or other. The Mavericks wouldn't be so much of a problem, but most folks in these parts respect a brand. They might ride over to the Running D to find out why Sutcliffe hadn't cut his beeves out of their herd, and they wouldn't much like what they found. The Transcontinental Railroad, whatever route it takes, won't be finished for another 2 years," White Fox said. "Shepard won't want to attract attention to his scouring of Texas before he's ready to claim ownership of the land." "That makes sense," Gibbons said, nodding. She dumped her ball of dough onto the cutting board and began to roll it out. "And we have at least some idea of how the zombies are created, though we're obviously missing some of the steps. But how does the preparation get into the liquor?" Easiest thing in the world, Jett said. Or do you think every saloon in the territories gets cases of whiskey in glass bottles, shipped by Overland Express? I suppose not, Gibbons said thoughtfully, though it could come by train as far as Abilene. And in Abilene there's a freight yard, and every box and barrel comes with a bill of lading, Jett said. All Brother Shepherd needs is an accomplice somewhere along the way to lever open a few kegs and dose them. The kegs come off the stage in Alsop, get shipped in the same load as any empty bottle the barkeep might have ordered. He fills his empty bottles from the keg, and... She shrugged. Shepherd could get the surrounding ranches, and the teetotalers the same way. Pickles come in barrels. So does vinegar. Or kerosene, White Fox said. Both Jett and Gibbons froze, looking around the room at the lamps. Then Gibbons shrugged. Too late to do anything about that. If his formula survives burning as well as distillation, we've all been exposed. Jett sighed. We know how he makes them. We know what he's doing with them. And we know how to kill them. So what are we still waiting for? Salt worked on Finley Maxwell, Gibbons said, picking up a knife and beginning to slice the biscuit dough into squares. But I don't know precisely why. Maxwell died of natural causes, so he isn't a typical case. Maybe that's the only reason the salt worked. And that means I can't be sure of killing the rest of Brother Shepherd's zombies. I need exact details of how they're made. There's only one place that information can be found, White Fox said into the silence. Somebody has to go back to Jerusalem's wall, Jett said. And preferably before Shepherd destroys another town, Gibbons added.